the hot springs in Rotorua area, and I had a colleague years ago. That tells you how old she was. But she thought the South area was nothing except spectacular trips.
We were going to talk, and when I came into session, John said, his wife was doing some research on the mayor. I said, you'll be waiting next week. Did HR talk to you about that?
Good morning. How are you aside from
I'm okay.
carrying big?
I'm doing okay. I'm okay. I'm a little tired, but other than that, I'm doing okay. I can't complain. I got an appetite. So.
No, it's just.
You got an appetite?
Not a lot. Enough.
It's okay.
Enough.
Good.
Enough. So that's my big
celebration.
celebration. I just want to eat.
Very close.
Oh, so the beginning months you didn't want to eat? Is that whole nausea thing?
Yeah,
Everything. No, I had it.
Everything. It's all.
I got it.
Pregnancies are not like that at all.
Oh, I guess they're all different.
Oh yeah, because I didn't want to eat at all. I was like, I'm not. And my husband was like, you gotta eat something. I'm like,
I can remember that smelling baby grease.
awful. Awful. And I love it.
I know, it was so weird. Oh my gosh. I'm glad you want to eat.
Spread out all over the Indian Ocean, all over the and they're related.
Non-fungible things online with his face. And not a cowboy.
No,
Superman.
Their languages are somewhat different.
Sterling, you're going the wrong way. They're virtual.
They're virtual.
And
he's sold over $1 million.
Also related to
For his
So you can make a quick exit. How are you?
No.
Yes.
No. But Madagascar, don't look at it. Sorry.
I've got Britta and Russell, three kids, usually come over Christmas. But they're going out to visit two brothers. So they're all coming. Today's our big Christmas day.
I know enough about it.
It's just the next big day. We're doing Christmas today.
And other.
I'm going to be around these other years. So I'm going to see them.
Their daughters is easy for me to
I got
remember.
a place from Wednesday to Sunday on the lake, or on the
I
ocean.
taught Donna. I knew it to her Katie, so.
It's going to be freezing
I know,
cold.
I taught her.
It's so cold, but I just love the ocean and I have friends there. So I just figure I'll go down there. Yeah, which is good because the kids are teaching me I'm just going.
Otherwise, when I worked downtown.
What about you? Yeah, you've got your kids.
David was 8th grade when I left, and Stephen was 9th grade when I came back. I left, I taught 9th grade and then left.
Good morning.
Came back.
Good morning. How nice, Sterling. 10 days. That's a long visit.
A whole lot. 3 years. Because I knew.
It's a long Christmas for him.
So we'll probably drive to Atlanta to see.
The first year I was back was very far.
You go in the front too.
Good morning.
No. She's already told me she's not.
Oh, I'm always back there. You gonna sit with us? Oh, sure, sit with me. I'm always back there.
I'm not going to take it personal.
Where does she
Everyone. No, but
This is a trade.
Flying up here on Charlotte.
Guy next to me.
Well, no, I'd be at Kennedy in the morning.
Do I need to worry about something?
Those are not.
Driving. I have.
So I learned, I was in Charlotte.
Oh.
All this stuff for a second, so my
I'm
job.
afraid that she does not stop at the grocery store on the way home. That's why I don't want cars anymore. I'm gonna leave guys, and if I have to stay, you're going nowhere. That's good.
I bet that happens a lot.
I bet it does too. We're moving somewhere. Wasn't funny to her. Funny to him.
I got up, I watched
She didn't stop.
it to see it.
We were just breastfeeding. Oh, my car. You have to use it now. I said, I had to turn these. Push your buttons.
Did you bring up
Lynn sent me this email note back there. Lynn, will you guys?
How are you?
We're walking here. Let me see. Okay, so Lynn sent me this email. It's a message.
Hiding in the back here.
I'm upset today.
And just in the last 2 weeks.
it's better?
Good morning.
Current enough that way.
But see, those push buttons must not be a good thing if you're robbing.
But you're never going to. You can push it through the dash. I tried.
You'll give us something new. I'm getting
Hey, Bill. How are you?
I'm here at Rumor Central with a question. I saw Jimmy Poole yesterday, and we were just chatting. And he said he'd talked to Emily today. And he said, oh, and she lives Sharon Thomas. Is she Sharon Thomas? Yeah.
Yeah, Evelyn is.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, she, in fact, she moved exactly the same month I did.
You are failing me. I need information.
When are you wondering?
A year and a half. Yeah, I think I will.
Don't listen to anybody.
I don't know anybody who I hear about them, but they never get identified. They never get identified. So they're either people I don't know or, I'll be 75, and I think that's to stop.
That was me. That was my. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. We need a bill.
I'm kind of a recluse much of the time.
Well, so,
You know what will determine my choice more than anything else? The balcony with winter sun.
everyone speaks.
Because I want to be able to sit outside and read as much as possible.
Hey, Grace.
And I've got 2 porches outdoors that have winter sun at different places.
The main building was all of that. It was really.
No, the new buildings.
No, all the.
Right, the old apartment, yeah. No, but it's winter sun. My mom had a south-facing balcony, and she ate lunch outdoors about probably 250 days a year.
Well, that would be.
If it was above 50 degrees, she was outside for lunch. And mine is morning. I don't you're right. I care what I say when I'm reading.
I was asked I love it. So many.
Well, I like yard.
You see what I mean?
And I cleaned up my house, but my brother and his family are coming for dinner today. And I cleaned yesterday. And
That'd be a nice.
and right.
And we,
Right. Yeah, no, I know.
A lot of people.
No, I know. You weren't there when the tomato grew. Have you heard about the tomato? Somebody planted a
Probably have a lot of
cherry tomato.
that was not one.
And it grew to the third floor.
When did this happen?
About 10 to 12 years ago. And the only rule was you could pick all you wanted as it got to your balcony if you kept count. and they ended up with like 1,400 tomatoes off that farm. At least ask somebody who's been there a while about the tomato.
That's what I'm not trying.
They made the news. I think probably the local paper, not the Observer.
Good presbyterians.
Maybe there's
Well,
just
Jimmy
one.
should.
I didn't want to lick them. Now, if I were home.
So what are you bringing tomorrow?
Yeah, I know.
Well, you're not gonna be there either. Oh my goodness, I was just.
Baby's good. The baby's sweet. I know, and I'm so glad she was scheduled on the 24th, and then she was supposed to have me tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then she had on early, so.
That was special.
It was.
She's beautiful too.
Oh, yeah. Of course.
Good morning. How are you, Bob? You have your There's two together.
What store?
Just been in touch with the sign and how to.
Oh, good. That was my turn.
Yeah, we were.
You never know, because Sure.
Working with you. We have
Kuykendall, she's a person that we probably have heard of as opposed to the previous. But anyways, he has to process his full-length program a little bit more quickly because we had the congregational meeting. So, John, tell us about Martin Luther and his correction.
Martin Luther's correction. I was going to go on a great list of autobiographical statements, but not really. Suffice to say, when I was a high school student, I saw a movie that was 3 hours long by myself, I remember, on an afternoon. Can't tell you why, but I went to the Visual Arts Theater in Charlotte and watched Martin Luther. Whereupon I was absolutely just enchanted by this personality. I didn't get much of theology, except that was the first time in my life that I can remember trying to figure out what this word grace is. But then out comes a book entitled Here I Stand. It had been published 2 years before that. But it's probably the first full-length adult biography I ever read, because those that I read before were those orange ones that said, it just really enchanted me. And it was written by a man called Roland Bainton, who at that time was the leading scholar of Martin Luther and probably on the Reformation in America, maybe in the world, one of the leading scholars at least. And the book that he wrote some 60 years ago, I guess, the book that he wrote was esteemed by a very fine church history scholar in the last decade as having said the finest biography of Martin Luther ever been written. So it's had some staying power too. And wrote it, Roland Bainton, was a professor at Yale Divinity School. Mitch and I spent a year there in 1964-65. At Christmas 1964, we went to a gathering of the whole Divinity School community in the common room, and this old man got up. The old man was 15 years younger than I am right now. The old man got up, and he began to recite verbatim major portions of the sermons of Martin Luther about Christmas. It was Roland Bainton. And Uncle Rolly, as they called him then, was supposed to be just an annual event at Christmas time in the divinity school, because he would stand there without a note, and then he would recite these large portions. Some of the same passages I'll read to you today. But after that, interpretations of the sermons of Martin Luther, not interpretation really, just translations of the sermons of Martin Luther, came out in a very small book called Martin Luther's Christmas book. And that's what I'm going to read to you from today after I give you a little background on Martin Luther himself. I will be mindful of the time and try to get you away from here in plenty of time to go to congregation meeting. Since I'm not a member of this congregation, I don't have to. So if you look at the outline that I gave you, let's focus on some background. I've said here that the emergence of modern Europe was a matter of multiple revolutions. Yes.
Go ahead and keep on talking. It's on. Yeah, I turned it off for a second. There's something not right. Just keep talking.
I call this multiple revolutions. This is not like the American Revolution or the French Revolution, but these were real paradigm shifts in the life of Europe. It really represents, 16th century represents kind of a break point between medieval Europe and modern Europe, and the revolution for multiple. For example, there was a revolution in geography, if you can imagine that. The whole European continent for a number of centuries had been facing toward the east. They've been facing toward the area where the Crusades took place. They've been facing toward the trade routes that developed after the Crusades. All of it funneled through Constantinople at that point. Well, all of a sudden, the Turks come in the middle of the 15th century and conquer Constantinople, and that just closes off any viable commerce between Europe and Asia at that point, because the Turks controlled the whole thing. So, what happened in 1492? With me already. Well, so anyway, all of a sudden you get Europe facing to the west rather than to the east, and you have exploration going on, Columbus being the first, perhaps, one of the more famous ones, and then eventually, within just about 2 or 3 years, the church gets into it, and Pope Alexander VI decides he can divide up the New World in behalf of the people who are sending money to Rome, I think. So he established this line of demarcation. It runs almost entirely down through the open sea until you get to that little bump, which is a part of Brazil. He said, okay, the people on the right-hand side of this bump are Portuguese. They belong to Portugal. People on the left-hand side belong to Spain. Who got the better end of that deal? But anyway, you got a geographical revolution. You also have an economic revolution taking place, because we're moving into the era of commerce and capitalism, the rise of a money economy. The great bankers of Europe, the Medicis in Florence and the Fuggers in Augsburg, begin to lend money to people, and they become, John, we doing all right, please? John looks so worried.
I'm actually listening to you, so. All right, I think we're good.
All right. Now, did you turn anything on?
No.
My hands behind the chair. But anyway, what you see is the development of a money economy. You begin to see the early stages of what we refer to as capitalism. There's a social revolution which attends that economic revolution, because the medieval strata, which were so well established and so permanent, with the nobility and the church on top and everybody else on the bottom, all of a sudden you begin to see this whole thing broaden and deepen, so that you not only have nobility, but you have high nobility and low nobility, and you begin to see the emergence very gradually of a middle class of artisans and merchants who more and more begin to call the shots in Europe within a period of about 100 years. Political revolution is taking place. For the first time, there are 3 discernible, self-conscious national states: France, England, Spain. Germany is not a part of this, but these 3 began to establish themselves as discrete entities, as national states. And then finally, and that's what brings us to what we're going to be talking about today, a religious revolution. The papacy had fallen into a ditch of arrogance and opulence and immorality. The clergy were neglecting their vocations more and more, and there was a lingering dissent among the faithful, but it usually was stamped out by the church. A man named Jan Hus had tried to do the same thing as Martin Luther was going to do about 70 years later, and he got burned at the stake for his trouble. But all of a sudden, we come to a different mode of life, and Martin Luther kind of personifies that mode of life. With regard to his childhood and his youth, his father, who was I guess you'd call him a part of that middle class because he was a mining engineer. And he wanted his son Martin to have something better. So he wanted his son, who was born in 1483, he wanted him to get a university education. He sent him to Erfurt, which was one of the university cities in Germany at that time. And he studied there. He was a very apt student. He got a bachelor's degree, he got a master's degree. He was wandering toward home at one point in 1505 after having completed both of those, and he got caught in a thunderstorm. And lightning was striking all around him, and he fell to the ground, and he said those fatal words, "By St. Anne, I will become a monk." Well, back at the house, that didn't go over too well. You had expected him to study law and be a prominent citizen. All of a sudden, he says he's going into the church. Well, that transition into the church was by no means something that went very easily for him. He was haunted by the fact that he was a sinful human being and he would never, ever, ever be able to stand before a righteous God. And so he was constantly in tension about his vocation, also about his immortal soul. When time came for him to perform his first Mass, he locked. He froze in celebration of the sacrament. And that was looked upon as a very, very bad sign. His father had come to see him celebrate his first Mass, and his father was sure that the devil had caught hold of his son and was going to take him away from him. But Martin Luther, at this young state in his life, was in an identity crisis. Erik Erikson, the psychologist, has kind of popularized that term, but Erikson popularized that term, you may not know this, in the context of a book that he wrote called Young Man Luther, in which he psychoanalyzed Martin Luther in those early days. And his conclusion was, to put it in a nutshell, was this was not a very great young man, this was a very sick young man who someday might become great. So here you have this period of tension in his life. He said of himself during that period of time, if ever a monk had tried to gain salvation by monkery, I was that person, because he was constantly being introspective. He had this confessor, von Staupitz, who was also a priest, and von Staupitz said, "Go away, do something worth reporting to me when you come to confession. Don't give me all these small petty details about your life." So he wanted him to, as Luther later said in another context, he wanted him to sin boldly. But eventually, Luther being the square peg in a round hole, they decided to send him off to a new university which was being established in the little town of Wittenberg, and they sent him there to teach Bible. He arrived there in 1512, and he began a systematic study of a few books of the Bible. He studied Genesis, he studied the Psalms, he studied Romans, he studied Galatians, intensively studied those books and taught his students in a new way, which was a very literalistic way, not talking about any kind of allegories, any kind of hidden meanings or anything. This is what it says, this is what it means. In the process of this, he himself was converted to a different understanding of Christianity. At some point in here, he had what was referred to, I love this German term, he had the Turmerlebnis, which means the tower room experience. We never have found out exactly what that tower room experience was, haven't found out what that tower room was. But whatever happened, all of a sudden he realized that he was not going to be justified by all of his penance, by all of his efforts to do good works. He was going to be justified simply by God's grace, by God's unmerited favor for him, and all he had to do, all he had to do was be faithful, to believe that that was what was going to happen to him in his life. And that was really a turning point for him, because all of a sudden he became a different sort of animal altogether. He became a person who wanted to advocate these new truths that he himself had discovered that seemed to have been forgotten by the Catholic Church. And so he found his way into various controversies. First one of those we all know about, which was the 95 Theses nailed on the church door, the chapel door in Wittenberg, inviting people to debate with him about the matter of indulgences. Indulgences, you may recall, is when a person could, by the paying of a certain amount of money, the person could gain liberation from purgatory by a shorter time in purgatory, or maybe even bypassing altogether and go straight to heaven. Well, there was a man who was making his way, Johannes Tetzel was making his way through Saxony, which is where Wittenberg is, making his way through Saxony, and all of a sudden he would sell indulgences here, there, and yonder. Even in Wittenberg himself, his slogan was, it was kind of a jingle, for every coin that in the coffer clinks, another soul from purgatory springs. That's better than old Pepsi had. So anyway, he wants to engage people on this basic point that the authority within the life of the Christian community should not be the church, but should be Scripture itself. And so he becomes, in a word, kind of a founder of a movement. He's recognized early on by the Pope. The Pope issues in 1520, issues one of his pronouncements called Exsuge Domini, which means rise up, O God, and defend your people, because, as the Pope said very graphically, there's a wild boar abroad in the vineyard right now. So here you could have this emerging controversy between Martin Luther and the church that was. And by 1523, he is involved, by 1523, he is involved, 1520, he is involved in a debate with the leaders of the church before a gathering of what was tantamount to the Parliament of the Holy Roman Empire. It was at that point that he made that famous statement, which the title of my book comes from, Here I Stand, because that was the point at which he was asked to recant of all the writings that he had done with regard to reforming the church. And he said, I can't do that. Here I stand. I can do no other. God help me. And after that, he was under death penalty for a number of years. He was spirited away from the 1520 meeting in Worms. He was spirited away to a castle called Wartburg Castle, where he was hidden away for about 2 years, almost 2 years, at which point he translated the New Testament into German. He also began to lay plans for the establishment of a different approach to Christianity within Germany. He had the great benefit of having the protection of the Elector of Saxony, more or less the Prince or King of Saxony, Frederick the Wise, and so he was given a kind of a ground of operation within Saxony. If he went out of Saxony, his head was under a penalty. So he stayed in Saxony. He went on to be the leader of a movement which spread throughout Germany and other places in Europe. In 1525, he married a former nun, Katie von Bora, and they had 5 children. He was a man who lived a life which was quite different from the life of clergy in any other generation since the early church. So here you have a person who is profoundly faithful to what he believes. You also have a person who is profoundly human. He lived a life of exaggerations. The storm exaggeration, by St. Anne, I will become a monk. And then first Mass exaggeration when he blew it. And then the 95 Theses on the door, and then the trial at Worms, and then the marriage, and then, I haven't mentioned this earlier, but the ink pot that he threw at the devil in his study one day. All these things say, here's a man who is intensely human. He had, I have to admit, something of earthy humor. He used some language that I only learned at Boy Scout camp. But he was an eloquent spokesman for the Christian faith, and very plain spoken about it. Now, his theological emphases, which you've all probably heard before, there's the three solas. Sola Scripture, that is, Scripture as the basis, authority for what the church should believe and how it should act. Sola gratia, that is, grace alone, not good works, but grace alone will save you. Sola fide, which is, my faith must be in the fact that that grace is sufficient for me. A couple of other things that were theological emphases that were going to be important later on. One of them was what we call the priesthood of all believers, which means that he believed that there were not two categories of citizens within the Christian community, the clergy up here and the rest of the people down here. Everybody had a Christian calling. He made a statement in one of his tracts, which was often quoted, that a shoemaker could be a priest of God and stick to his cobbler's bench while he did so. What that meant was that everything in common life could be sanctified, could be sacred, and you didn't have this situation in which the clergy were up here living one sort of life and everybody else down here was just scrambling to do the best they could. So you have this situation in which everybody is incorporated into the active life of the Christian community. One other thing about his theology that bothered me, and may bother some of you too, he had this idea of the two kingdoms, which was quite simply that there was God's kingdom on earth over here, and there was the kingdom of this world operating over here. You could do things in God's kingdom, but you couldn't quite ever make anything work out in the secular kingdom. So we have a situation in the Lutheran tradition which is sometimes quietist, which doesn't raise any serious conflict when something bad is happening in the human body politic. I think that's one reason I'm not a Lutheran, but a Calvinist, because I believe you can do some things to help out in the society in which we live. Well, to his preaching, Martin Luther preached 150 to 200 sermons for 30 years, every year for 30 years. He preached a lot on Christmas because he followed the liturgical calendar, the historical calendar of the Christian community. So beginning with Advent and going all the way through Epiphany, he focused upon the texts that have to do with the birth of Christ. We have some 2,300 of his sermons that are extant. They are profoundly personal, as you will see. They are very human. They are very emotional. He gives attention to both the gifts and the foibles of the human condition. And what he manages to do in some of these sermons is to transport first century Palestine into 16th century Saxony when he preaches, and you'll hear that in some of these passages that I want to pass on to you. Now, we have a crush before us, and I have my own personal Vanna White seated here. Who's going to help us, and we're going to populate the creche. The first,
Can I say that I can pass them around? The last person who gets it, please put it.
all right, and
Wherever you are.
don't break them, please. These, I have several creches, and this one is, for me, the most human of all because of the way they're cast in very graphic form with personalities in each one of them. So pass it around. First of all, the angel Gabriel. Let's note that this angel is called Gabriel. His name means power. He was commander-in-chief of the heavenly host, the keeper of the sword, the marshal of divine majesty. 1,000 angels were at his beck, and their radiance was more dazzling than 100 suns. If angels should speak to us in the majesty they enjoy in the presence of God, we could not endure the sight. The name angel means a messenger, and Gabriel, the chief, had already been used to carry a message to Zacharias. Why should God employ angels on such tasks? Could he not find a priest or a prophet from Jerusalem or a preacher in Nazareth? The angels, though they are mighty princes in heaven, are not ashamed to be used as messengers. And Gabriel did not resent being used as an errand boy to carry word to a lowly maiden. his glory was set aside, and he appeared to her simply in the guise of a comely youth. I don't know how you knew that, but that's possibly true. Another thing about Gabriel a little bit later on has to do with this is when he comes when the angel Gabriel makes the pronouncement of peace on earth, goodwill to men in the nativity story in Luke. He said, "Lo, the angel of the Lord came upon them, and the glory of the Lord shone round about them, and they were sore afraid." The field was filled with light, brilliant, dazzling. Not the town, but the field was lighted up. Why did not the angel go to Jerusalem? There was the worship established by God. There were the princes of the people and the rulers of church and state. There were the temple and the high priest ordained of God. Why did not the angel go to them? He went to Bethlehem, a dung heap compared to Jerusalem. There's that dung heap compared to Jerusalem, as Pratal, that was a little village in Saxony, is compared to Nuremberg. And he didn't even go to the town of Bethlehem, but he just went to the shepherds. Another passage about the angel Gabriel. This is with regard to the peace on earth, goodwill to men. These are not the words of man. This preaching is from heaven, and God be praised, it is communicated also to us. For it is just the same to hear and read this preaching as to receive it from an angel. The shepherds didn't see the angels, they only saw a great light and heard the word of the angel, just as one can hear it now or read it in a book, if eyes and ears are open to learn and rightly to use. If one does not know the baby Jesus, it is impossible that one should rightly honor God. Because men do not know and revere this child, they rage and devour each other. Where this child is accepted, there will be plenty and healing upon earth. But what is it like where Christ is not? What is the world with if not downright hell and nothing but lying, greed, gluttony, drunkenness, adultery, assault, and murder? That is, from the very devil. Friends can no longer be trusted more than foes. But those who hear the angels sing, who know and receive the baby Jesus and give due honor to God, are like gods to their fellow men, peaceable, kind folk, glad to help and counsel anyone. When God is honored, then men are friendly, without hate and envy, each regarding the other greater than himself, and saying, "Dear brother, pray for me." So much for the angel who makes the announcement. Then, of course, the next character of great consequence is Mary.
John, what's the name of the book that you're?
I'm reading from Martin Luther's Christmas book. And I looked it up, I think it's available in used books in paperback still. Now about Mary, the name of the maiden was Mary. The Hebrew form of the name is Miriam, and it means bitter myrrh. Why she was given this name, I do not know, save that the Jews had the custom of naming children from the circumstances of their birth. Now, the time when Christ should come was one of utter bitterness and extreme poverty for the Jews. They were a downtrodden people, and their lot was pitiable like ours is today, so that we all may weep bitterly. Among the downtrodden people, Mary was among the lowliest, not a maid of high station in the capital city, but a daughter of a plain man in a small town. And yet, this is the one whom God chose. Angel greeted Mary and said, "Hail Mary, full of grace." That is the Latin rendering, which unhappily has been taken over into the German. Tell me, is that good German? Would any German say you're full of grace? He knows what you mean if you say that a purse is full of gold. But what is he to make a girl full of grace? I have translated "thou gracious one," but if I were really to write in German, I should say, "God bless you, dear Mary, Liebe Maria." For any German knows that this word Liebe comes right from the heart. "Dear Mary," said the angel, "the Lord is with you. Blessed are you among women." Also on Mary, the evangelist Luke tells us that when Mary heard that her cousin Elizabeth was pregnant, Luke inserts the word, she went with haste. Now, pardon me, if some of these things sound a little misogynistic. I think he was a man of his time, but it's worth hearing anyway. He meant that she didn't stop every 5 paces to strike up a conversation, as do so many of our maids and matrons today. He knew the ways of women and did not wish to give them any handle for justification from the example of Mary. He meant to say that Mary was like a maid who sees and hears nothing save the commands of her mistress, or like a housewife who does not loiter here and there to chat. The mother of our Lord was no gossip. She went with haste. That means that she did not act like a pilgrim, but circumspectly. The women, therefore, have no warrant in saying, why should we not go hiking, seeing that Mary went over to the hill country and she was a virgin? Yes, but Mary had the command of an angel, and she went with haste. You have no command to do as you please. And one last thing on Mary. This is marvelous. See how purely she leaves it all to God and claims for herself no works, honor, or reputation. She behaves just as she did before any of this was hers, seeks no greater honor, is not puffed up, vaunts not herself, calls out to no one that she is the mother of God, but goes into the house and acts just as before. Milks cows, cooks, scrubs the kettles, sweeps the house like any housewife would do, as if none of these overwhelming gifts or graces were hers. Among the other women and neighbors, she was esteemed no more highly than before, and did not ask to be. She was a poor townswoman among the lowliest. What a simple, pure heart was hers. What an amazing person she was. What mightiness was hidden below her lowliness. And then, of course, there is that other figure in this whole thing, in terms of the family constellation, if you will, and that is a man called Joseph. He doesn't deal all that kind with Joseph sometimes. Scripture says that he took with him Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. She would have had good reason to excuse herself from making the journey so close to her time, but she said nothing because she wished to trouble no one. We can see how poor Joseph must have been, that he could not afford to hire some old woman or neighbor to stay with Mary and look after her while he was gone to Bethlehem. And then, of course, the thing that I quoted on the page I gave you. The journey was certainly more than a day from Nazareth in Galilee to Bethlehem, which lies on the farther side of Jerusalem. Joseph thought, when we get to Bethlehem, we shall be among relatives and can borrow everything. A fine idea that was. Joseph had to do his best. And it may well be that he asked some maid to fetch water or something else, but we do not read that anyone came to help when the baby was born. They heard that a young wife was lying in a cow stall and no one gave heed. Shame on you, wretched Bethlehem. The inn ought to have been burned with brimstone, for even though Mary had been a beggar maid or unwed, anybody at such a time should have been willing to give her a hand. There are many of you in this congregation who think to yourselves, if only I had been there, how quick I would have been to help the baby. I would have washed his linen. How happy I would have been to go with the shepherds to see the Lord lying in the manger. Yes, you would. You say that because you know how great Christ is. But if you had been there at the time, you would have done no better than the people of Bethlehem. Childish and silly thoughts of these. Why don't you do it now? You have Christ in your neighbor. You have Christ in your neighbor. You ought to serve him. What do you think do to your neighbor in need? You ought to do you are doing to the Lord Christ himself. So that's, now, briefly, the hero of the whole show. Jesus is, of course, through the whole thing. But this one passage really makes me feel the closest to Luther's idea of what the baby at the nativity must have been. Let us then meditate upon the nativity just as we see it happening in our own babies. I would not have you contemplate the deity of Christ, the majesty of Christ, but rather his flesh. Look upon the baby Jesus. Divinity may terrify us. Inexpressible majesty will crush him. That is why Christ took on our humanity, save for sin, that he should not terrify us, but rather that with love and favor he should confirm and console and confirm us. Behold Christ lying in the lap of his young mother, still a virgin. What can be sweeter than the babe? What more lovely than the mother? What fairer than her youth? What more gracious than her virginity? Look at the child, knowing nothing, yet all that is belongs to him, that your conscience should not fear, but take comfort in him. Doubt nothing. Watch him springing in the lap of the maiden. Laugh with him. Look upon this Lord of peace, and your spirit will be at peace. See how God invites you in many ways. He places before you a babe with whom you may take refuge. You cannot fear him, for nothing is more appealing to us than a babe. Are you affrighted? Then come to him, lying in the lap of the fairest and sweetest maid. You will see how great is the divine goodness, which seeks above all else that you should not despair. Trust him. Trust him. Here is the child in whom is salvation. To me, there's no greater consolation given to humankind than this, that Christ became a man, a child, a babe, playing in the lap and at the breast of his most gracious mother. Who is there whom this sight would not comfort? Now is overcome the power of sin, death, hell, conscience, and guilt. If you come to this gurgling babe and believe that he has come not to judge you, but to save. That kind of wraps up the whole thing on here. Now, let's talk about some of the other characters. Is the baby come around? Another focus of his preaching, which I think is really wonderful, is the shepherd. He's talking about shepherds in the field keeping watch over their flocks by night. And then this is what he says. That was a mean job, watching flocks by night. Common sense calls it no low-down work, and the men who do it are regarded as trash. But the evangelist lauds the angels because they proclaim their message only to shepherds watching their flocks by night. These were real sheep herders. And what did they do? They did what shepherds should do. They stayed in their station and the work of their calling. They were pure in heart and content with their work, not aspiring to be townsmen of nobles or envious of the mighty. Next to faith, this is the highest part, to be content with the calling in which God has placed you. I have not learned that yet. Who would have thought that men whose job was tending unreasoning animals would be so praised that not a pope or a bishop is worthy to hand them a cup of water? It's the very devil that no one wants to follow the shepherds. The married man wants to be without a wife, or the nobleman to be a prince. And it is, if I were this, if I were that. You fool! The best job you have, the best job is the one you have. If you're married, you cannot seek a higher status. If you're a servant, you're in the very best position. Be diligent and know that there are no greater saints on earth than servants. Do not say, if I were, say, I am. The maid who's always thinking to herself, if I were only someone else, will end up with a bad husband. Look at the shepherds. They were watching their flocks by night, and the angel made them apostles, prophets, and children of God. Caiaphas and Herod and the high priest were not deemed worthy. I'd rather be one of those shepherds than that the Pope should make me a saint or the emperor make me a king. Another thing on the shepherds. The shepherds have gone to Jerusalem and now coming back. And the shepherds returned, glorifying and praising God for all the things they'd heard and seen as it was told unto them. That's wrong. We should correct this passage to read, they went and shaved their heads and fasted and told their rosaries and put on cows. Instead we read, the shepherds returned. Where to? To their sheep. Oh, that can't be right. Did it not leave everything and follow Christ? Must not one forsake father and mother, wife and child to be saved? But the scripture says plainly that they returned and did exactly the same work as before. They did not despise their service, but took it up again where they left off with all fidelity. And I tell you that no bishop on earth ever had so fine a crook as those shepherds. Now we turn to the Magi. 1, 2, 3. Melchior, Caspar, Balthazar. We don't know who they are. The gospel calls them magi, not so much prophets as magicians, masters of secret lore. They were not wizards in league with the devil, but experts in the properties of nature, like the alchemist who can turn copper into gold. But such secret knowledge of nature was given by God's Spirit to Jacob and to Solomon, and was in great vogue in Persia and Arabia. It's a noble art and has produced many wise men. But the art has degenerated into necromancy and has been so abused by the devil that today magician has fallen into disrepute. These magi, or wise men, were not kings, but learned men in the art of nature. Without doubt, they dabbled in superstitions, but they allowed themselves to be guided entirely by the course of the star. And then the star was simply a sign to the Magi, and the astrologers are not in a position to base their art upon this passage of the Gospel. The wise men did not try to cast Christ's horoscope. They simply saw this was a sign of a great king, and they asked only where he was. In order to give no comfort to the astrologers, Christ made a brand new star with the sign of his birth. How the Magi knew that this star meant the birth of a king is more than I know, but I don't see the great miracle there. Okay. If we Christians would join the wise men, we must close our eyes to all that glitters before the world and look rather on the despised and foolish things. Help the poor, comfort the despised, and aid the neighbor in need. Do not boast that you have built churches and endowed mass. God will say, What to me are your churches and masses? What do I care about your altars and your bells? Do I take pleasure in stone and wood? Is not the heaven my throne and the earth the footstool for my feet? Who told you to build churches? I have set before you spiritual temples. These are the things you should build, feed, and help. But you've gone about doing foolish things which I commanded not. I know you not. And finally, on the Magi, we can present our gifts the same way the Lord said. It is what you have done to the least of one of my brethren, you've done it unto me. He who gives his goods to help the poor, to send children to school, to educate them in God's word and other arts, that we may have good ministers, he is giving to the baby Jesus. He is not only born poor, but needy also, on account of Herod, had at once to flee the country. On the journey into Egypt, the presence of the wise men must have come in very handy. So in our day, we should not forget those who are suffering persecution. Now, behind the scenes, folks. Behind the scenes, we have Herod the king. At their report, that is the report of the wise men, Herod the king was troubled and all Jerusalem with him. Why was Herod terrified and all Jerusalem with him? He had good reason to be afraid because he had tyrannized over the Jews for 30 years. Though a foreigner, he was acquainted with the prophecy that the scepter should not depart from Jacob. And now that the time is fulfilled, he trembled and thought to himself, I have been king for 30 years, and now the people are getting ready to oust me, and these foreigners come and ask openly in the city for a newborn king. That sounds bad. Another thing on my man Herod. Oh, yeah. The slaughter by Herod of all the children of Bethlehem and the region about was a piece of sheer barbarism. But doubt not that Herod would find a plausible defense so that people would regard it not as tyranny, but as necessary severity. The world is the master of this art when it comes to the Christians. And then one more, and we don't have a fresh person for this, but this I thought was worth our hearing anyway. It's about the presentation of Jesus at the temple. and two people, Simeon, the prophets so-called, Simeon and Anna were there. The text relates that when Mary and Joseph brought Jesus into the temple, only two persons were there out of the populous city. Is it not shocking that from more than 20,000 men, only Simeon should be present? The priest pocketed the 5 groschen and paid no more attention to the child. Is it not shameful? Ought not half the town at least have come out to see the Lord of all the world? But because there was no pomp, no one gave heed. Mary and Joseph brought him in alone. None but Simeon and Anna were there. So it is today with our world. This is a very kind of negative sound. This is part for the rest of us. So it is today in our world, even among Christians. If it were only the Turks, the Jews, and the bad princes, it would be bearable. But we Christians are the ones who despise him. The Pope, the bishops, the fanatics, the peasants, the townsmen, the nobles tread him underfoot. And I do it myself. I cannot believe in him as I should. He ought to be my true friend and comforter. But the old donkey in me won't have it. And the devil blows the blows. In my heart, it is just as bad as in the world. Christ is a sign to be spoken against. The final word about what we are to do. Finally, we must both read and meditate upon the Nativity. If the meditation does not reach the heart, we shall sense no sweetness, nor shall we know what solace for humankind lies in this contemplation. The heart will not laugh nor be merry. As spray does not touch the deep, so mere meditation will not quiet the heart. There is such richness and goodness in this Nativity that if we should see and deeply understand, we should be dissolved into perpetual joy. And those are just some among many passages which are really wonderful for this season of the year. And we have before us the creche. We have before us the words about the creche from this singing church. And we have before us a week before Christmas comes. So thank you very much. We have a few minutes. Just a few minutes. We can talk if you wish before you go to.
Are the figurines Mexican or Peruvian, or do you know?
I think they're Appalachian, but I'm not sure. We have a box full of creches, a big box full of creches.
Does anybody get off by the expressions?
I love that. So, John, what's the story on how you got that creche?
I can't remember.
It's been there for a long time?
It's been a long time of collecting creches, and lots of times I say, oh, that's great, and this is somewhere else in the store. So.
I wish we ought to make up a story about that.
There was an old farmer up in Buncombe County. Sorry, I'm
I played a good job.
John, was that a book that you were reading from?
Well, this is a compilation of passages from Luther's sermons that Professor Bain shows as kind of worthy. There's innumerable other sermons about the Christmas season too, but he picked these out. And what he did, and I didn't do this because I decided to go with the creche personality this time, but what he did was he set up kind of categories, and he would have one section on Mary and it had one on the Annunciation first, then you have one on this personality, that personality, and then certain events, and it just follows scriptural stuff mostly.
I would like to have heard Martin Luther say some of those things. Read some of those.
It would have been in German, though.
Well, you can hold back. I mean, and think about that. volume of preaching in 150 to 200 in any given year, and other people in the same church in Pittsburgh are also preaching. They preach 3 times a day, 7 days a week. So you got through the Bible.
And the sequence of reference or Luther's reference to the tower, but wasn't he imprisoned in the tower or what?
No, he was not imprisoned. He was under protective custody by Frederick the Wise. But there was a tower there. But this was earlier in his career. This was where he became an activist, and it might have been a mystical experience. We just don't know what it was. I'll tell you privately something else about the tower. But anyway, it was one of those turnaround experiences in his life.
Yeah, I think we were all taken with the humanity, the touching, the earthiness is the word. The earthiness of those figures, and the earthiness of the manger, and the earthiness of the humanity, the raw humanity that Luther speaks of.
That's exactly what he's doing. Not only the humanity of the Christ child, which he pushes more than the divinity, not that he didn't believe in the divinity, but when he looks at the nativity, he sees the stable. He really understands what the nitty-gritty of the whole thing is. And I think also, one of the things I read about this period of preaching was that they were so intent upon trying to make the gospel available to ordinary human beings that they really pushed on that humanity thing. And of course, in the Renaissance, prior to this, you've got the whole emergence of a re-evaluation of the nature of humanity. And you know, what worth is a human being? And I think this kind of flows right naturally out of that too. Luther was not himself a humanist. The humanist movement, which was abroad in Europe at that time, didn't particularly touch him, but he knew that. It was kind of in the atmosphere. Then when you come to Calvin, in half generation later, Calvin was a humanist scholar before he was anything about the church. His first publication was something about the philosopher's stone. So he was just imbued with that. And if you read Luther's works versus reading Calvin's Institutes, for example, Calvin's Institutes are just replete with all these references, not simply from the Bible, which he knows backward and forward, but all these humanist scholars, all these philosophers and things like that. Luther didn't have much time with all that. And he wasn't trained that way either. But nevertheless, it was just in the air that a human being was worth something. And so how do you establish that worth? Well, you establish that worth because here's a child of God. Here's a child for whom Jesus came incarnate as one of us. That's the way he put it.
I can't think of a more appropriate way to thank you for your talk and to bring us into the humanity of our own lives and this birth that's coming up on the 25th. John, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. The next opening class will be the second week in January. We get 2 Sundays of celebration.
Yeah. Yeah, really.
Wow.
I didn't know that about you. Oh, okay. A is a PK. Yeah. Well, I don't know I saw my parents and my sister. Well, I do lots of other things, but not